The Great Smoky Mountains stretch across the border of Tennessee and North Carolina, quiet, endless, and patient. Beneath their fog and heavy timber, countless trails wind through valleys that never seem to end. But one story has lived here longer than any other. It began on a warm Father's Day weekend in 1969, when a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Martin vanished while playing hide-and-seek with his family near Spence Field. Within minutes, he was gone. Within hours, a storm erased his trail. What followed became the largest search in the history of the National Park Service, and one of the strangest. Today, more than 50 years later, rangers, historians, and hikers still return to the same ridges, drawn by a question that refuses to fade. How can a child disappear in daylight, surrounded by witnesses, and leave no trace at all? This is the story of Dennis Martin and the mountain that never let him go. The vanishing in Spence Field. On the afternoon of the 14th of June 1969, the Martin family, William, Clyde, Dennis, and Douglas, arrived at Spence Field, a grassy mountain clearing on the Tennessee-North Carolina border of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The Martins were an experienced hiking family from Knoxville. They had come to camp and celebrate Father's Day in the quiet wilderness where the Appalachian Trail passes through open ridges and dense forests of spruce and fir. The area was remote but well known to hikers. Rangers described it as a place of calm weather, sloping meadows, and bird calls that carried across the ridgeline. That day, the Martins met another family, the Key family from Alabama, who were hiking in from Cades Cove. The children were close in age. They began playing a game of hide-and-seek among the trees and knee-high grass, while the adults sat nearby, watching. At around 4:30 p.m., Dennis, who was 6 years old, decided to hide behind a bush near the trail. His father, William, saw him slip away. It was meant to be a quick joke, a surprise, but after a few minutes, Dennis didn't reappear. When his father called his name, the woods stayed silent. William walked to where Dennis had been hiding. There was nothing there. He checked the nearby brush, expecting a laugh or a jump scare from his son. Instead, the meadow stretched out quietly. The trees around Spence Field absorbed his voice as he called again and again. The other children stopped playing. The light began to shift. By 5 p.m., concern turned into organized searching. William Martin split from the group and began moving downhill along the Appalachian Trail, calling out and whistling. The rest stayed in the field in case Dennis returned. Within an hour, heavy clouds gathered. A storm was rolling in from the west. At 8 p.m., the rain began. It was one of the heaviest storms the park had recorded. That summer, more than 2 inches fell overnight. Temperatures dropped. The ground became slick with mud. Dennis was still missing. William hiked 5 miles in the dark to the ranger station at Cades Cove to report his son's disappearance. By dawn on June 15, the largest search effort in the park's history had begun. Over the next few days, more than 1,400 people joined rangers, volunteers, Boy Scouts, and members of the National Guard. Helicopters circled the valleys. Dogs were brought in, but struggled to track any scent because of the rain. The terrain was steep, full of sinkholes and creeks that twisted through thick brush. A few miles west, a family from Carthage, Tennessee, Harold and his son, reported something unusual to rangers. On the same afternoon, Dennis vanished. Around 4:30 p.m., they had been hiking near Rowan's Creek, just below Spence Field. They heard what Harold later described as an awful scream. When they looked up towards the ridge, they saw something moving, a figure, rough-looking, dark and shaggy. They thought it was a man, possibly a bear. It disappeared quickly into the trees. This sighting was logged, but not immediately shared with the Martins. The location, Rowan's Creek, was several miles away through rugged, almost inaccessible wilderness. Search teams didn't reach that area until days later. By then, the rain had washed away any tracks. The first organized search grid covered an 8-square-mile radius. Rangers used compasses and ropes to keep straight lines through the forest. Every few minutes, they would shout Dennis's name. The echoes came back empty. The FBI joined by June 20. Their field notes mention that the case remained classified as a missing child in wilderness conditions. Though some rangers expressed doubt, specialist trackers from the U.S. Army Green Berets arrived from Fort Bragg. They operated separately, avoiding coordination with park personnel. No one was told why. Witnesses remember them searching at night, using infrared scopes, moving quietly and deliberately through ravines. Their presence added a layer of mystery. Some believed they were looking for more than a lost child. On June 22, searchers found small footprints along a creek bed near Russell Field. The prints were barefoot and small, possibly a child's. But the area was heavily traveled by rescuers, and rain had blurred the details. The find was inconclusive. Days stretched into weeks. Food drops were airlifted into campgrounds for the searchers. Helicopters hovered low, their rotors shaking treetops. Dogs from the Air Force Rescue Division were brought in and trained to detect human scent underwater in case Dennis had fallen into one of the many sinkholes or streams. None detected anything. By July, the official search was scaled down. More than 56,000 man-hours had been logged. The FBI closed its active involvement. William Martin stayed in the park for weeks afterward, walking the trails each morning, mapping valleys by hand, returning each night to Spence Field. He told one ranger, "There's something out there that doesn't want to be found." Over the years, the case would continue to draw speculation. Some believed Dennis had wandered deeper into the mountains and succumbed to exposure. Others suspected animal attack. Yet no torn clothing, no bones, no trace was ever recovered. The search area eventually stretched to 56 square miles, an enormous distance for a child his age. When asked decades later, retired Ranger Dwight McCarter said, "In all my years, that's the one that stays with me. We combed every hollow. You don't lose a boy in daylight that close without finding something." The Great Smoky Mountains remain one of the most visited national parks in America, but the area around Spence Field feels unchanged. The grass grows thick each summer. The trails fade under the fog. On quiet days, visitors say they can still hear the wind carry faint calls through the ridges, search voices that never stopped. There are no markers or memorials near the site, only the same wooden sign pointing toward the Appalachian Trail. The forest keeps its distance. The search that never slept. The morning after Dennis Martin vanished, the fog settled low over Spence Field. Visibility was reduced to a few yards. The rain from the night before had turned the ground into soft mud, washing away any footprints that might have shown which direction the 6-year-old had gone. Rangers began their initial sweep at sunrise, starting from the bush where Dennis had last been seen. The area was gridded, marked with flagging tape, and expanded outward in careful rings. Every call of his name seemed to dissolve into the mist. By 9 a.m., the first official teams arrived from Cades Cove. Park rangers, wildlife biologists, and a small group of Boy Scouts began moving toward Russell Field, a mile to the west. Helicopters were requested from nearby McGee-Tyson Air Force Base, but cloud cover delayed their launch. It was only when the weather began to clear later that afternoon that the full scale of the effort became visible. By June 15, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was no longer quiet. Trucks filled the parking lot at Cades Cove Ranger Station. Radios crackled constantly. Over 1,400 searchers would eventually cover the terrain rangers, volunteers, National Guardsmen, Green Berets, and civilian rescuers. The park had never seen anything like it. Maps were unrolled on wooden tables under canvas tents, coordinates were plotted, and the term sector sweep became routine. Rangers worked in teams of 4, using compasses and string to maintain straight lines through the dense undergrowth. Each group carried whistles, signal mirrors, and notebooks for marking finds. By day's end, the teams reported nothing. That first week, rain continued almost daily. Each storm reset the landscape. Tracks blurred, rivers overflowed. The Little River, which cut through much of the lower search zone, became difficult to cross. Many rescuers developed hypothermia and had to be evacuated. Still, the search continued. On June 17, the National Guard arrived with portable radios and field rations. Their presence brought a new rhythm. They established a base camp at Spence Field and began airdropping supplies for the searchers in the valleys below. Helicopters from the Tennessee Air National Guard scanned ridges with spotlights at night. Park rangers documented each sweep in handwritten logs, noting time, temperature, and location. Every entry ended the same way, no sign. Ranger notes from those days mentioned the eerie quiet that settled after dark. The forest, saturated and heavy with moisture, absorbed every sound. When you called out, one ranger wrote, it came back as if someone else whispered it farther away. The FBI joined on June 19. Their field agents interviewed both the Martin and Key families separately, comparing timelines. They also questioned hikers who had been on the Appalachian Trail that weekend. Most had seen nothing unusual. A few mentioned a smell of smoke near the Russell Field shelter, but no campsite was found. That same day, the Green Berets arrived from Fort Bragg. Their presence surprised many park personnel. They operated independently, rarely speaking to rangers. They established their own perimeter near Cades Cove and refused media interaction. When questioned, officials stated that their training in rugged terrain made them ideal for such conditions. But some rescuers recalled them using advanced equipment, night vision scopes, radio scramblers, and even aircraft navigation aids uncommon for civilian operations. They worked through the night in complete silence. One volunteer reported seeing them moving in single file, without flashlights, communicating through gestures. They were looking for something specific, he said years later. It didn't feel like they were looking for a boy. Meanwhile, families from across Tennessee arrived offering help. Park rangers accepted only trained searchers to avoid contamination of possible evidence. The press established a base at Cades Cove, where each day officials gave briefings. The tone was always measured. We are continuing to search all possible areas. By June 20, hope had begun to thin. The terrain was punishing. Searchers crawled through rhododendron tunnels so thick they had to pass their gear hand to hand. Streams wound between cliffs and sinkholes. Many of these holes were deep enough to conceal a person completely. Rangers mapped over 70 such hazards within a 5-mile radius. Each was checked. None yielded results. On June 21, a child's footprint was found near a creek leading toward Russell Field. It appeared small, barefoot, and fresh, though the print was distorted by water. Dwight McCarter, an experienced ranger tracker, examined it. Could be Dennis, he said. But there were also Boy Scouts searching barefoot nearby. The print was photographed, measured, and then dismissed as inconclusive. Later that day, a helicopter spotted a possible red object near Big Hollow. It was difficult to confirm through the trees. A team was dispatched on foot, but the location was steep and slippery. After hours of climbing, they reached the site. It was a fragment of red candy wrapper, caught in a branch. Dennis had been wearing a red shirt the day he disappeared, but this was not his. Days passed without progress. The search extended farther each morning, covering new valleys, descending into darker hollows. A second base camp was established near Sea Branch. The operation became mechanical grid, mark, move, repeat. By June 25, exhaustion was visible on every face. The FBI recorded that over 13 square miles had been searched on foot. Aerial sweeps had covered over 50. Food drops continued by helicopter, but the crews reported turbulence over certain valleys, where instruments briefly malfunctioned, compasses flickered, radios went silent. It was noted, but not investigated further. When July came, only a skeleton crew remained. The National Guard withdrew. The Green Berets packed their equipment quietly and left without statement. The official operation was scaled down to a handful of rangers and volunteers. On July 14, exactly 1 month after Dennis disappeared, the last major search was completed. In the final ranger report, one line stands out: no physical evidence located. Search to remain open. The case was never officially closed. Some rangers later said the mountain had taken him. Others believed the answer lay in a place the search never reached beyond the mapped ridges, where no one had reason to go. The sighting below Rowan's Creek. On the 15th of June 1969, the same afternoon Dennis Martin disappeared. Another family was camping several miles away from Spence Field. They were the Keys from Carthage, Tennessee, Harold Key, his wife, and their 2 sons. They had chosen a remote area near Rowan's Creek, close to the boundary between Cades Cove and the western slopes of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Their location was roughly 7 miles away from where the Martins had been playing that day. The Keys were not connected to the Martin family. They were spending Father's Day weekend hiking through the park's less travelled sections. Around 4:30 inches the afternoon, as clouds began to gather above the ridgeline, they heard a sharp, sudden scream echo from the north. Harold described it later as a terrible guttural sound, the kind that makes the hair on your neck stand up. His wife asked if it might have been an animal, but Harold was sure it sounded human. Moments later, his youngest son pointed toward a slope across the creek. Through the trees, they saw movement. A figure was descending the ridge quickly, moving in a crouched position, as if trying not to be seen. Harold said the figure appeared rough-looking, covered in something dark. It moved upright like a man, but seemed broader, almost shaggy. They watched as it vanished into the tree line. At the time, they dismissed it as a man hunting illegally in the park. Firearms were prohibited, but poaching was not uncommon. Still, the scream stayed with them. When they returned home a few days later and heard about the missing boy on the news, Harold contacted the park rangers immediately. On June 22, he and his family met with the National Park Service and gave a full statement. Harold drew a simple map of their position and pointed to the approximate direction of the scream. Rangers estimated that their location was about 2 miles downwind of Spence Field, separated by rough, steep terrain. If the timing was accurate, it meant that the scream they heard occurred almost simultaneously with Dennis's disappearance. However, the report was not immediately followed up. By the time rangers reached the Rowans Creek area, rain had already washed away most tracks. Searchers found no signs of campfires, clothing, or prints. The ground was soft, but thick with leaves. Visibility was poor. When the key report finally reached the Martin family through a local newspaper, William Martin requested that search teams focus on that area. The National Park Service initially declined, arguing that the terrain between Spence Field and Rowans Creek was too difficult for a 6-year-old to traverse in such a short time. But Harold Key's account continued to circulate among volunteers and locals, gaining quiet momentum. In later years, Harold maintained his memory clearly. He said he knew what he saw that day, a large, human-shaped figure carrying something over its shoulder. Some interpreted this literally. Others claimed the detail was added later through misquotation. But in a taped interview conducted in 1970 by park investigators, Harold said plainly, "It looked like a man carrying a bundle, maybe something red." Dennis Martin had been wearing a red shirt when he disappeared. This detail reignited interest among both searchers and residents of the nearby valleys. The region was home to old families who had lived along the park's borders for generations. Some told rangers of isolated homesteads deep in the hills, people who avoided contact, living off the land, outside of census or government record. These stories were often dismissed as folklore, but they lingered. One ranger noted in his field log, "Locals report feral families rarely seen, unverified." The note was never followed up. The Rowans Creek sighting eventually found its way into the FBI file. Agents wrote that while the account was credible, the distance between the two locations made it unlikely to be related. They closed the reference under the heading Unconfirmed Correlation. Years later, retired Ranger Dwight McCarter revisited that decision. He had hiked those same ridges for decades. In a 2005 interview, he said, "People don't realize how the land folds up there. You could scream on one side and hear it 2 miles off like it was next to you. The sound bends. It doesn't travel straight." If that were true, the Key family might have heard something closer than the maps suggested. The scream could have come from within a half-mile of their camp, perhaps from the same ravine that searchers avoided because of its steep drop-offs. That section, Rowans Creek Hollow, remains one of the least explored parts of the park. The military teams, including the Green Berets, did search near the area for several days. They never shared their findings publicly. When journalists asked park officials years later about the reason for the military's involvement, the standard reply was that the terrain required specialists trained for survival operations. No report from those units has ever been released. In the absence of answers, the Key sighting became a dividing line. For some, it was proof that Dennis had been abducted, either by a person hiding in the wilderness or by something else entirely. For others, it was an unrelated coincidence, magnified by the stress of a missing child and a community desperate for meaning. But the coincidence remains striking. A child goes missing at 4:30 p.m. on a clear afternoon in Spence Field. At the same moment, 7 miles away, a family hears a scream and sees a dark, upright figure moving through the forest with something red. Between them stretches a maze of ridges, hollows, and shadowed passes that even experienced rangers struggle to navigate. Nothing was ever found near Rowans Creek. No footprints, no fabric, no remnants of clothing. Yet, in the decades that followed, that name Rowans Creek became inseparable from the mystery itself. When rangers talk quietly about the case today, they lower their voices when that location is mentioned. Some say the sound that afternoon wasn't human. Others say it was. The forest, even now, has no opinion. The man who wouldn't stop searching. When the official search ended in mid-July of 1969, most of the teams packed up their gear and left the Great Smoky Mountains. Helicopters were grounded. The tents at Spence Field were taken down. Only the imprints of boots and the faint grid markings on trees showed how large the operation had once been. But William Martin, Dennis's father, did not leave. He stayed in the park for weeks after everyone else went home. Rangers later said they would see him each morning at dawn, standing near the same spot where Dennis had last been seen. He carried a notepad and a map marked with hand-drawn grids. He traced routes along the ridges with a pencil, then set out alone into the brush. William was not a man prone to imagination. He worked as a civil engineer in Knoxville, known for his calm and methodical way of thinking. But something about the silence of that place refused to let him rest. He believed Dennis was still somewhere within those ridges, either hidden or taken. Every evening, he returned to his tent, wet and exhausted, and updated his notes by lantern light. Locals who lived near the Cades Cove entrance remembered seeing him walking the roads at night with a flashlight. He would stop to ask if anyone had seen strangers passing through, hunters, drifters, or people camping illegally. Some residents told him about sounds in the woods, low whistles, dogs barking at unseen movement, but nothing he could verify. In August, William expanded his search beyond the official perimeter. He began hiking through the remote drainages leading toward Eagle Creek and Hazel Creek, places few people entered. He carried rope, a compass, and enough food for days at a time. Rangers warned him about bears and sudden floods, but he insisted he was prepared. One of them, Dwight McCarter, later recalled, he wasn't looking like a man in denial. He was looking like someone who thought something was being hidden from him. During these weeks, William met several rangers who had participated in the original search. Some shared quiet frustrations about lost time, conflicting orders, and the military presence that never explained itself. William asked one ranger why the Green Berets had refused to coordinate their findings. The ranger shrugged. "They weren't under park command," he said. "We were told not to ask." The deeper William went, the more he noticed strange absences. Areas marked as searched in the official maps showed no footprints, no ribbons, no sign of human passage. He began marking these zones with an X in red ink. His notes, later given to the National Park Service, mention an odd detail. Certain sectors labelled as cleared show no disturbance at all. In early September, William hiked toward the vicinity of Rowan's Creek, following his own compass readings. He wanted to see the area where Harold Key had reported hearing the scream. The path was overgrown. It took him nearly half a day to descend through tangled rhododendron. The creek at the bottom was cold and fast-moving. He searched along both banks, but found nothing, no torn fabric, no bones, no tracks. That night, he camped alone near the water. In his journal, he wrote one line, "The woods don't sleep here." He continued returning to the park every weekend that fall. In October, he met with a few volunteers who had participated in the search, local men from Blount County, who offered to help him cover areas beyond the ridge. They spent several days exploring drainages that fed into Hazel Creek. In one of them, they found an old stone foundation covered in moss and half buried by soil. There were remnants of an iron kettle and pieces of rotted wood. It appeared to be the remains of a long-abandoned cabin. William reported the find to rangers, who logged it but said it had no relevance to the disappearance. The foundation was estimated to date from the 1,920 seconds before the park's creation. But for William, it confirmed something he already suspected, that the wilderness still hid traces of people who once lived beyond record, far from trails and maps. By November, the cold forced him to stop searching. Snow fell across the higher elevations. The park closed several roads for winter. William returned home to Knoxville, but the search did not end in his mind. He began corresponding with the FBI, requesting reports and maps. Most of his letters were answered with short, formal replies. Investigation ongoing. No new information at this time. In private, William told friends he believed the truth lay in something unspoken during those first days of the search. Too many people were there, he said, but no one seemed to see what mattered. The following spring, he returned again. He retraced every trail from Spence Field to Russell Field, marking fallen trees and washed out sections. He took photographs of old logging cuts and faint depressions that could have been shelters. His notes became more detailed, more technical. They read less like the writings of a grieving father and more like those of an investigator cataloguing evidence. When asked why he continued, William answered quietly, "If I stop, it means I've accepted the version they wrote, and I don't believe it." His persistence earned him quiet respect among some rangers and quiet discomfort among others. A few began avoiding interviews on the topic. Officially, the park maintained that all reasonable efforts had been exhausted. Unofficially, some wondered if William had uncovered something he wasn't supposed to see, or at least sensed there were limits to what they could say. Years later, when the case was revisited in local archives, William's hand-drawn maps were found among the files. They showed the entire western slope of the park covered in a lattice of red and black lines, small circles where he had searched, and notes in the margins. One entry read, "Silence deeper, on the third ridge, no birds. Compass spun once, then corrected." To this day, those notes remain the most detailed record of the terrain ever made by a private citizen during a search operation in the Great Smoky Mountains. No one ever found Dennis Martin. But in the years that followed, rangers said they could still recognize William's markers, small ribbons tied to trees, faded by time, still hanging in places where no official search ever went. The silence in the files. When the official search ended, the paperwork began. Over the months following Dennis Martin's disappearance, thousands of pages were generated: search maps, daily logs, weather reports, and personal statements from rangers, volunteers, and military personnel. Yet, as time passed, the collection of documents seemed to grow thinner rather than larger. Many files existed only as summaries. Entire sections were redacted or marked unavailable. Inside the National Park Service archives in Gatlinburg, the Dennis Martin case is filed under Incident 69M2. It begins with a straightforward report: child missing, last seen near Spence Field at approximately 1,630 hours. The next pages detail search areas, weather impact, and resource deployment. Then suddenly, the tone changes. Paragraphs referencing the involvement of external agencies are replaced with blank spaces or black bars. The sections labelled military coordination and external personnel are missing entirely. Rangers who worked the case remembered more than what the documents now show. One, identified in later interviews as Charles McIntyre, said, "We filled out daily briefings who searched where, what was found, what wasn't. But when I saw the file years later, half of those weren't there." Another ranger added, "It felt like someone had decided what history should remember." The FBI file, obtained decades later through public record requests, follows a similar pattern. The earliest pages describe cooperation with the Park Service, but after June 22, the entries become shorter, colder. No significant developments, search ongoing. Later notes mention the arrival of specialized personnel without names or ranks. The final FBI memo, dated the 14th of July 1969, closes the record with one line: "Case remains open, no further federal action." But within the margins of these official records lie odd fragments that survived. A typed ranger note from June 20 mentions a temporary suspension of communication in Lower Hollow's possible interference. Another describes unusual compass readings reported by Green Beret teams near Russell Field. The anomalies were never investigated. When journalist Dwight Huff later attempted to assemble a timeline in the 1,980 seconds, he discovered that several maps used during the original search had vanished from the archives. The remaining maps were reproductions, missing the hand-drawn annotations from rangers. In one memo to the park superintendent, Huff wrote, "The absence of these primary documents significantly alters our understanding of the area covered." He never received a response. Among the few surviving materials are transcripts of radio logs. On June 18, a transmission recorded at 10:43 a.m. reads, "Unit 7, confirm movement south of C Branch, possibly visual contact." The reply from command is cut off. A later note adds, "No confirmation possible, echo or reflection." In the years that followed, researchers noticed inconsistencies between official statements and first-hand accounts. The park's report listed no credible evidence of abduction, yet the FBI kept the file under the category missing possible kidnapping until 1970. When questioned about this, officials said it was a clerical error. Rangers recalled submitting personal logs that never appeared in the record. Some of these surfaced decades later in private collections. One, belonging to Ranger McCarter, contains an entry dated June 23. FBI requested removal of all volunteer reports from file, reason unspecified. Another entry, dated June 26, mentions military units working separately at night, no coordination, no access to data. This compartmentalization created what investigators later called the gap. Between June 19 and June 23, several major decisions were made, expanding the search radius, reassigning leadership, and bringing in new personnel. Yet there is almost no paperwork explaining those transitions. It's as if the command structure had momentarily disappeared. When Freedom of Information Act requests were filed decades later, the National Park Service acknowledged the missing records, but claimed they were likely lost due to water damage during storage. The FBI confirmed that portions of the file were destroyed as part of a routine records purge in the 1,970 seconds. No originals were preserved. For historians, the remaining fragments reveal more by what they omit than what they contain. There are detailed inventories of food and fuel, but almost no mention of the Green Beret deployment. There are weather logs for each day, yet no note of the violent storm that struck on the evening of June 14. One internal memo from the park's 1,970 annual report mentions unprecedented public interest in the Martin incident and significant administrative review. The next line is blacked out. When former Ranger McCarter was asked in a later interview if he believed files were deliberately removed, he paused before answering, "I don't think it was a cover-up. I think it was a clean-up. They didn't want confusion on paper." Still, a quiet unease remains in those archives. Researchers who have handled the folders say that even the physical evidence feels incomplete. No photographs of the footprints, no aerial images of search grids, no original weather logs. Only retyped versions remain, as though the originals were rewritten for clarity. In 2014, when historian David Douthert attempted to compile all known records into a single archive, he counted 47 missing items referenced in surviving documents, memos, maps, and photographs that were cited but no longer exist. He described the absence as a silence built into the record itself. For the Martin family, those absences became the last barrier. William Martin's letters to the National Park Service stopped around 1971. His final note simply read, "If no one can explain what was removed, the silence will have to do it for them." That silence still defines the case. In the archives, the last page of the official report bears only a signature line and a faint stamp that has partially faded. The word "closed" is barely legible. The theories that wouldn't settle. As the years passed, the disappearance of Dennis Martin became less a case and more a landscape of speculation. In the absence of physical evidence, people began to construct explanations out of fragments, out of distances, timings, sounds, and the empty spaces between them. Each theory seemed to fit only part of the puzzle, yet none could close it. The earliest assumption was the simplest, that Dennis had become lost and succumbed to exposure. The Great Smoky Mountains were vast, and the weather had turned suddenly on the afternoon he vanished. Rangers noted that a 6-year-old could not have covered much ground before the storm. The search grid accounted for this. They found no clothing, no bones, no trace. Wildlife experts argued that scavengers could have scattered remains within hours, but even so, not a single item was ever recovered, not even his red shirt, which should have stood out against the green slopes. A second theory emerged among park staff, that Dennis had fallen into one of the limestone sinkholes scattered across the ridges. These natural cavities, sometimes 20 or 30 feet deep, could easily swallow debris and conceal it beneath soil and leaves. In 1970, cavers from the University of Tennessee explored several known sinkholes within the search radius. They found old animal remains, rusted tools, but nothing connected to the missing child. The sinkhole idea faded quietly. Then came the third theory, the one that never went away. It suggested that Dennis had not wandered off at all, but had been taken. The timing of the scream heard by the Key family at Rowan's Creek matched the moment Dennis disappeared at Spence Field. The figure they saw moving through the trees carried something red. For many, the correlation was too precise to ignore. William Martin himself leaned toward this view. He said publicly in 1970, "I do not believe my son simply got lost." He stopped short of using the word abduction, but the implication was clear. The FBI file supports that suspicion with its early classification of missing possible kidnapping, yet no suspect was ever identified. Local law enforcement briefly considered known offenders in surrounding counties, but no leads emerged. The park's remoteness made abduction improbable without a vehicle or road access. Still, the theory persisted, fed by the presence of military teams operating under sealed orders. Some believed that whatever those teams were searching for, it wasn't Dennis, but something or someone connected to his disappearance. By the late 1970s, a new generation of hikers and amateur investigators began to add layers of folklore. In local circles, whispers about wild men living deep in the park resurfaced stories that predated the park's creation. These tales spoke of hermits or feral families surviving off the grid, avoiding contact with rangers. The Rowan's Creek sighting, with its rough, dark, shaggy figure, fit easily into this folklore. Journalists dismissed it as mountain myth, yet even rangers admitted that parts of the park had never been fully surveyed. In 1985, a retired search volunteer named Harold Beck published a short pamphlet privately titled "The Boy Who Vanished in the Rain." In it, he proposed that Dennis might have encountered a recluse living illegally within the park, possibly in one of the uncharted hollows. Beck claimed that during the search, a few rangers discovered a small lean-to shelter near an abandoned logging trail, but were instructed not to report it. His account was never verified, but it reignited local speculation about secret inhabitants. Other explanations took on stranger tones. Some pointed to magnetic anomalies reported by search teams, compasses that spun without cause, radios that went silent. A few connected these with the region's history of plane crashes and electromagnetic interference. In the 1,990 seconds, when paranormal investigators began exploring missing person clusters in national parks, the Martin case was often cited as an early example. They noted the military's unexplained presence, the scream, the vanished evidence, and the way the story seemed to fold in on itself. Yet, for all the theories, one detail remained steady. Dennis disappeared within sight of several adults in broad daylight. His father watched him hide behind a bush no more than 50 feet away. Within minutes, he was gone. No struggle, no sound, no trace. Some modern analysts suggested cognitive misperception, a phenomenon where the dense forest and uneven terrain distort perspective. What looks like 50 feet in the Smokies may in fact be closer to 150. A small child could slip into a ravine invisible from the ridge. But search teams covered those ravines thoroughly. The ground gave up nothing. Another line of thought revisited the possibility of mistaken identity. Could the Key family's sighting have been a coincidence? Another hiker in dark clothing carrying gear. The scream and echo of thunder rolling through the valley. It was plausible, but the timing and direction of the sound continued to trouble those familiar with the case. In 2002, forensic anthropologist Dr. William Bass reviewed the available files. His conclusion was cautious. Without remains, all we have are narratives. When asked privately what he thought happened, he paused and said, "The mountain holds what it wants." Over time, even those closest to the case began to accept that some questions would remain unspoken. The FBI file closed formally in 1974. The National Park Service archived its records under the category Unresolved Missing, but unofficially, rangers still talked about the incident as if it had happened yesterday. New recruits at Cades Cove were often told, "Don't lose anyone on Spence Field." It became part of the park's quiet oral history. Today, hikers still pass the same meadow where the Martins once picnicked. The trail markers are unchanged. The wind moves through the grass, as it did then, and the distance from bush to tree line remains impossibly short. No single theory ever settled the question. Each possibility led to another gap, another silence. Somewhere between logic and legend, the story simply stopped, and the forest resumed its stillness. The mountain that remembers. More than half a century has passed since the afternoon Dennis Martin vanished in the Great Smoky Mountains, yet the story remains rooted in the soil of the place itself. For those who work the trails or guide visitors through Spence Field, the event is not simply history, it is a living presence, recalled in fragments, murmured in low tones at ranger stations, and embedded in the unspoken rituals of the park. Every June, when the mountain laurel blooms and fog rolls across the ridges, rangers who were not yet born when it happened still feel the weight of that weekend. They walk the same slopes that the searchers once gridded by rope and compass. The terrain has not changed much. The spruce still lean in the same direction, bent by decades of wind. The grass at Spence Field still waves in slow patterns, and when the mist thickens, the distance between trees can look as narrow and deceptive as it did in 1969. Some of the older rangers still mark that date without speaking it. A few leave small red ribbons tied discreetly to branches near the trail's edge. They do it quietly, without telling visitors. Others keep copies of the old maps, hand-drawn grids from the search folded inside their patrol logs. "It's a reminder," one ranger said in a 2019 interview. "Not of danger, but of humility. You can lose someone here faster than you can take a breath." Visitors rarely notice anything unusual about Spence Field. To most, it's an open, peaceful meadow high above the clouds, a stop along the Appalachian Trail where hikers eat lunch before continuing to Rocky Top or Russell Field. But those who linger sometimes describe an odd sensation, a stillness that feels heavier than the quiet of other clearings. Birdsong fades earlier, the air feels close, almost expectant. Guides who lead small groups through the area avoid discussing why. They simply move on after a few minutes. At the Cades Cove Visitor Center, a small, unmarked folder rests behind the counter. It contains photocopies of early newspaper clippings about Dennis Martin. The Park Service does not display them publicly, but when visitors ask about the case, rangers may bring out the folder, opening it to faded headlines. Boy lost in Smokies. Storm hampers search. Father leads hunt. The photos show the same meadow, the same slope, before the vegetation grew back. A few locals claim that even after the official search ended, faint echoes could be heard for years afterward, whistles, calls, or voices carried by the wind. It wasn't ghosts, one longtime resident said. It was the sound of people who didn't stop calling his name. The memory has settled into the mountain, the way moss settles on stone, quiet, persistent, unmovable. In 2008, a backcountry ranger hiking near Russell Field reported seeing a single child's shoe lying on a slope after a heavy rain. It appeared old, worn, but the rubber had long deteriorated. It was impossible to date. The Park Service collected it and sent it for analysis. It was found to be from a size and make common in the 1,970 seconds, too late to belong to Dennis. The incident still circulated among staff as a kind of echo, a reminder of how easily stories resurface when the forest gives back small pieces of its past. Even today, hikers post photographs online showing the meadow where Dennis vanished. Some caption them with simple words, "For Dennis." Others note how strange it feels to stand in a place that has been searched by thousands and still holds its secret. There is no monument, no plaque, only an unbroken line of trees and a trail sign pointing toward Russell Field. Night in that part of the park arrives fast. The fog rises from the valleys and the wind begins to hum through the branches. The darkness there is deeper than most visitors expect. Rangers advise campers not to wander after dusk. It isn't superstition, simply awareness of how the terrain folds and hides even familiar landmarks. But those who have stayed overnight near Spence Field often speak of waking suddenly, certain they heard a voice calling from far off. When they listen again, there is only the sound of rain or the creak of trees in the wind. In local towns like Townsend and Maryville, the story of Dennis Martin is retold each summer. Some remember the search helicopters shaking the rooftops as they passed overhead. Others remember strangers coming into stores asking for food donations for searchers. Many who were children then say it was the first time they learned how a person could simply vanish without trace. The event became part of the region's quiet folklore, told not for drama, but as a reminder of respect for the land that surrounds them. Retired Ranger Dwight McCarter, one of the last men alive who searched the ridges in 1969, still lives near the park boundary. In an interview before his retirement, he said softly, "Every time I walk up there, I think maybe I'll find a small piece, something that says we were close. But the mountain doesn't give away what it keeps." At the National Park Service archives, the case remains open, though there have been no new leads for decades. Each few years, a new request is made for access to the full file. Each time, the answer is the same: no additional records located. Yet the story never fades. It exists as part of the park's unwritten memory, carried in the whispers of guides, in the cautious tone of briefings, in the way silence fills the trail when the fog moves in from the valley. When hikers stop at Spence Field today and stand where the clearing opens to the sky, the view is vast and calm. There is nothing to suggest what once happened here, no marker, no trace of loss. Yet those who pause long enough sometimes say the same thing. The mountain feels alive, listening, aware, as if it remembers the records that time forgot. By the early 1,980 seconds, more than a decade after Dennis Martin vanished, the search for him had shifted from the woods to file cabinets. The physical hunt was long over, the trails had closed, the ribbons had faded, and Spence Field had grown over with high grass. What remained were papers, letters, reports, maps, and notes scattered across agencies. Yet even these began to fade, misplaced through transfers, water damage, and what officials later called routine record management. In the archives of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the file labelled Incident 69M2 sat on a high shelf in a beige folder. At first glance, it looked complete. Inside were forms stamped and initialed, weather summaries, and daily search reports. But archivist Martha Jenkins, who began cataloguing park records in 1982, noticed gaps. "There were days that should have been there but weren't," she said years later. Whole sequences just stopped. She found repeated references to maps that no longer existed: Map A, Map D, Map F. The cross-references led nowhere. The Park Office contacted the National Archives in Atlanta, hoping duplicates might have survived among transferred federal records. They found nothing. The National Archives responded that any supplementary maps or aerial photos may have been retained at the field office or destroyed under Retention Schedule 7C. No one could explain what Schedule 7C meant, in this context. In 1984, Jenkins discovered a small metal box mislabeled Weather Logs 1968. Inside were damp curling sheets of paper, carbon copies of ranger notes from the Martin search. Some were nearly illegible, the ink smeared by moisture, but faint pencil writing could still be read. Sector 5B cleared no tracks, compass fluctuation, Team 4 rerouted. Another page read, request to cross into unsearched hollow, denied, reason not given. These notes were not in the official case file. Jenkins dried them, flattened them, and filed them under recovered field logs. At the same time, other agencies quietly released portions of their own material. The FBI provided limited records in response to requests under the Freedom of Information Act. Most pages were heavily redacted, names blacked out, margins stamped, released with deletions. Still, even with half the text missing, the documents revealed more questions than answers. A memo dated the 23rd of June 1969 referenced continuing coordination with unnamed military unit. Another, from early July, simply read, advise Park Command to limit civilian speculation. Archivists tried to reconstruct a timeline from what remained. The deeper they looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. The weather reports did not match the ranger summaries. One report listed heavy rainfall on June 14, another from the same day described clear conditions. Photographs that should have shown search lines or base camps were missing, replaced by later reprints. The original negatives were gone. Over the decades, bits of the missing record surfaced in unexpected places. A retired ranger found an envelope of photos in his attic, showing Spence Field during the search. Another ranger's widow donated a notebook containing handwritten grid coordinates not found in the official file. A private collector in North Carolina claimed to own a reel of 16mm footage showing helicopter sweeps taken by local news crews, but the film's current location is unknown. By the late 1990 seconds, historians attempting to piece together the complete chronology faced a patchwork of half-preserved fragments. Some sections had been rewritten by later officials summarizing earlier data. Others were clearly copies of copies, lines faint and distorted. Each reproduction moved the record further from the original moment, until what remained was more interpretation than evidence. In 2001, a team of park historians launched a project to digitize old missing person files. When they reached the Martin case, the digital scanner picked up Ghost Impressions' faint outlines from sheets that had once been stacked together. Under certain light, traces of erased words appeared, Rowan's Cra and Obserd Munant. The fragments were preserved as is, unedited, filed under illegible content retained for reference. Through these discoveries, a strange pattern emerged. The older the document, the less it revealed, as if time itself was erasing not only the physical paper, but the intention behind it. Archivists developed a quiet superstition about the case. They said every time the file was opened, humidity in the room would rise slightly, fogging the edges of their glass scanners. No one wrote that in the logbooks, but the rumor persisted. In 2010, a new archivist named Eric Poole began cataloguing field audio recordings from the 1,960 seconds and found a reel labeled Cades Cove, June 69, Channel 4. When played, it contained a faint transmission, static, wind, then a man's voice saying, negative on sighting, return to grid 4. A second voice followed, copy, standing by, hold, there's movement. The tape ends there, mid-sentence. That recording was digitized, enhanced, and placed in the park's sound archive, but its origin remains unknown. No official record lists a Channel 4 transmission that day. Every decade, someone returns to the file, hoping to find what was missed before. Each time, the result is the same bits of data that hint, never confirm. The folders have been replaced twice due to wear. The paper edges have yellowed. The smell of old carbon ink fills the archive room whenever it's opened. Visitors who request to view the materials, sign a ledger, and receive the same warning from archivists, handle gently. Some of these pages are the only copies left. When the pages are lifted, they crinkle softly, as if breathing. In the end, what remains of the Dennis Martin case exists less as an investigation and more as a collection of echoes, voices, coordinates, and redacted lines. The forest kept its silence. The record followed suit. Between the two lies everything that time has quietly taken back. The shadow over Rowan's Creek. Rowan's Creek lies deep within the folds of the Great Smoky Mountains, a narrow valley of tangled brush and steep slopes that few hikers ever reach. From above, it appears peaceful, a dark ribbon of water threading through the green expanse west of Spence Field. But those who know the park's history say that the place carries a different kind of quiet. The name alone has become shorthand among rangers for a region they prefer not to enter unless necessary. In 1969, the Key family camped on a ridge that overlooked this very creek. They were not the first to report strange sounds there, and they were not the last. Long before Dennis Martin's disappearance, early rangers described Rowan's Creek as difficult terrain, dense, erratic compass readings, and recurring animal movement without clear calls. Few details survive from those reports, but the descriptions align with what later searchers experienced when they followed the Key sighting. The creek itself is deceptive. It begins as a trickle beneath the ridge that separates Tennessee from North Carolina and deepens into a twisting channel lined with slick rock walls. On clear days, the light rarely reaches the bottom for more than a few hours. The humidity never fades, and even in midsummer, the air remains cold enough to fog a lens. When the Martin searchers descended into the valley, they found that radio signals weakened or died completely. 2 searchers reported their compasses spinning briefly before resetting. No official cause was recorded. Ranger Dwight McCarter later told a journalist, "It's a mean place to get into, and worse to get out of. You don't go down there without a reason." For decades after the disappearance, that reason rarely came. The trail leading toward Rowan's Creek was never formally reopened. When asked why, the Park Service cited erosion and unsafe crossing. But among longtime rangers, the unspoken reason was the same one whispered about since 1969, the memory of what might have moved through those woods. Over the years, small reports trickled in from hikers who strayed too far west of the Appalachian Trail. In 1977, a pair of campers claimed they heard a single human scream echoing through the valley near dusk. They left their gear behind and hiked through the night to Cades Cove. Rangers investigated the next day, but found only the campers' fire ring and boot prints. A few years later, in 1983, a wildlife photographer reported seeing a large figure cross the creek at twilight, describing it as dark and upright. No trace was found. Most of these incidents were quietly recorded and filed as unverified observations. Yet, within the ranger community, they added weight to the old unease surrounding the area. When new rangers were trained in backcountry safety, Rowan's Creek was sometimes mentioned not by policy but by caution. "If you end up down there," one instructor would say, "keep moving." Locals who live near the park boundary in Blount County also hold stories about that valley. An older resident named Clara Hughes recalled her father warning her as a child not to wander beyond the ridges near Hazel Creek. He said there were places where the trees grow too close and the light doesn't know what to do with itself, she once told a reporter. Those were the places people didn't come back from. In the 1,990 seconds, researchers from the University of Tennessee used aerial LiDAR scanning to map forest density for ecological studies. Their images of the Rowan's Creek Basin showed irregular depressions in the ground, collapsed pits, or sinkholes hidden under canopy. Some were large enough to hold a small cabin, others deep enough to conceal an entire tree. The report, though unrelated to the Martin case, offered a glimpse into why the area had always seemed unpredictable to those who searched it. Even in modern times, the name carries a quiet stigma. When the National Park Service updates maps for hikers, the creek appears without trails or points of interest. On official charts, it's simply a contour of shadows. For years, hikers have shared stories online of sudden temperature drops or the feeling of being watched while traversing nearby ridges. Rangers neither confirm nor deny these accounts, but none recommend camping there overnight. During one maintenance mission in 2009, a crew sent to inspect storm damage near the lower creek reported hearing low whistling sounds that seemed to move with them through the trees. They returned to camp earlier than planned. The report was brief 4 sentences, but it remains on file. Satellite images taken in winter, when leaves are gone, reveal faint outlines of old paths leading toward the creek. These routes no longer appear on maps. Some historians believe they are remnants of logging trails from before the park was established in the 1,930 seconds. Others suspect they were created during the 1969 search and later reclaimed by the forest. Whatever their origin, the tracks end abruptly along the northern slope, where the water bends east. It is the same area where the Key family claimed to have seen movement, where Harold Key said he saw a dark, rough figure carrying something red. When archivists revisited the case files in the 2000s, They noted that the coordinates of that observation were listed but not clearly mapped. A section of the original search grid that should have covered that point was labeled inaccessible. No record exists showing it was ever searched. In ranger lore, Rowan's Creek is no longer spoken of as a theory or clue. It is spoken of as a place that resists closure, a boundary between what the park knows and what it prefers not to revisit. Guides on backcountry patrol say that when fog settles over the valley, it muffles everything: footsteps, breathing, even the rush of water. They say it feels like standing inside the absence of sound. Those who pass by the overlook sometimes stop and look down into the shadows below, trying to trace where the creek runs. They say the air feels heavier there, as if something older than memory still lingers beneath the canopy. And when the wind shifts, carrying across the ridgeline, a few claim they hear something faint like a voice half lost in the distance, calling once, then gone. The Green Beret detail. When the US Army Special Forces arrived at Cades Cove in June of 1969, the Rangers were told little beyond the phrase, "military assistance authorized." They came in small groups, men in olive fatigues carrying sealed crates and unfamiliar equipment. Their trucks bore no unit markings. Some carried rifles, others had radio packs and infrared scopes, not yet common outside combat zones. They spoke little and did not wear standard park-issued identification tags. Within a day of their arrival, their camp was established on the outer edge of the search zone, fenced with tape, off-limits to volunteers. Officially, they were there to assist. In practice, they operated separately. Rangers noted that their movements were never coordinated with Park Command. Each morning, they disappeared into the fog, splitting into teams of 2 or 3, heading toward the higher ridges west of Spence Field, precisely the direction of Rowan's Creek. They returned at dusk, silent, recording nothing in the joint logs. Captain Barry Meadows, a National Guard officer who had been overseeing the airlift operation, recalled in a 1972 interview, "They didn't check in or out with us. They had their own chain of command." When asked what their purpose was, he said only, they were looking for something very specific. The park superintendent at the time, Keith Nielsen, wrote a brief internal memo referring to Army coordination under Fort Bragg command. That memo is one of the few surviving documents that directly names the Green Berets. The rest of their involvement survives only through recollection. Search volunteers, who worked nearby, remembered hearing them moving at night boots on gravel, the click of metal equipment, and low murmured radio calls. They worked in absolute darkness, using no lights. A few rangers tried to follow, but were told to turn back. "They didn't want us close," Ranger Charles McIntyre said years later. "Whatever they were tracking, they didn't want civilians near it." By the third week of the search, tension between the military unit and park staff had grown. The Green Berets refused to share reports or discuss their findings. When the FBI attempted to coordinate, they were told the soldiers were under separate authority. After July 1, their presence became sporadic. Some teams left the area altogether, while others continued to patrol valleys far beyond the official perimeter. Later, when the park compiled its final summary, the section labelled Military Assistance was left blank. It was noted only that specialist personnel provided search support during initial period. No further explanation was offered. Years afterward, retired park employees tried to fill in the silence with their own recollections. One helicopter pilot remembered flying several of the soldiers to a remote ridge above Sea Branch, where they offloaded what looked like portable sensors. The next morning, the pilot returned to find them gone. "They left no trace," he said. "Even the grass where they'd camped was pressed flat, like they'd packed in the dark." Rumours spread quietly through ranger circles that the soldiers had found evidence they never disclosed. One account, passed among volunteers, claimed they had retrieved something small near Rowan's Creek, a piece of fabric or bone, but that it had been sent directly to Fort Bragg for testing. No official record supports this, and no such item was ever logged by the park. When reporters asked the Department of the Army for comment in the 1,970 seconds, the answer was short: no records responsive to this inquiry. In the 1,980 seconds, a journalist from Knoxville named John Reiner interviewed former Fort Bragg personnel who had served that summer. One man, speaking anonymously, confirmed that a detachment had been sent to assist civilian authorities in the Smoky Mountains. "It wasn't unusual," he said. "We trained for search and rescue. When pressed about the secrecy, he paused. It wasn't what we were told it would be. The terrain was strange. The readings were off. Compasses didn't settle. After a week, we were ordered to pull out." The phrase, "the readings were off," appears in multiple accounts, though its meaning remains uncertain. Some suggest electromagnetic interference from iron deposits. Others think it referred to malfunctioning sensors the unit brought with them. In either case, the soldiers' abrupt withdrawal left park rangers uneasy. One ranger recalled a conversation with a sergeant from the team on their final day. When asked if they'd found anything, the man shook his head and said quietly, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Then he got in a truck and left. After their departure, the Green Berets left behind only 2 visible traces: tire marks in the mud and a stack of wooden crates labelled property of US Army, return Fort Bragg. The crates were empty. The following year, when the National Park Service requested after-action reports from all agencies involved, no military report was ever received. Internal correspondence shows repeated requests sent to Fort Bragg between 1970 and 1972. Each was answered the same way: no additional information available. For those who participated in the search, the soldiers' silence became one more layer of mystery. Some thought their presence had been exaggerated, that the public had turned a logistical detail into a legend. Others, who had seen them firsthand, were less certain. "They moved like men used to danger," said MacArthur. "You could tell they weren't here just to look for a child." Over the years, the image of the Green Beret teams has become part of the case's mythology: men in the fog, moving without sound, carrying instruments no one else understood. For researchers, their role remains the most puzzling element of the record, documented but unexplained, confirmed yet incomplete. Today, their names are gone from official listings. Even the Fort Bragg unit designations from that period have changed, restructured, or dissolved. When asked, the Army Public Affairs Office says only that training operations often supported civilian agencies during that era. At Cades Cove, a few of the oldest rangers still remember watching the soldiers vanish into the trees. "They looked like they belonged to a different world," one said, "and whatever they were looking for, they never told us if they found it." The creek, the mountain, and the record have remained silent ever since. The vanished hour. The official timeline of the 14th of June 1969 remains deceptively simple. Dennis Martin was last seen at approximately 4:30 p.m. at Spence Field, and within 30 minutes the first thunderclouds rolled in from the west. Between those 2 points, a half hour, perhaps less, lies the most scrutinized stretch of time in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It is the vanished hour. Every statement agrees on the start. William Martin saw his son step behind a bush near the tree line. The other children planned to circle around and surprise the adults. They were laughing. Then, in seconds, Dennis was gone. William called his name once, twice, and then began walking the short distance to the spot where his son had disappeared. When he reached it, there was only the sway of leaves. At that exact moment, the park was quiet. The afternoon was warm, humid, and still. Later, witnesses recalled how even the insects seemed to stop. Then, a low rumble began, distant thunder that hadn't yet reached the field. By 4:45, William Martin was searching beyond the clearing, shouting. Other family members fanned out. They assumed Dennis had run downhill toward the Appalachian Trail. In the calm before the storm, voices carried clearly across the ridge, yet none of them heard any reply. At 5 p.m, the first drops of rain fell. William continued down the trail for nearly 2 miles toward Russell Field Shelter, calling at intervals. The path dipped and rose, curving sharply through the trees. He later told rangers that visibility was so poor he might have missed someone standing 10 feet away. Meteorological records show that the storm that hit the Smokies that evening moved faster than expected. Winds shifted abruptly at 5:10 p.m, and within minutes, sheets of rain began to fall. In less than an hour, the park recorded 2.5 inches of water. Streams overflowed, hollows flooded, and the temperature dropped from 65 degrees to 50. The air pressure fell sharply enough to trigger compass deviation in several search instruments later used that night. If Dennis had been within a mile of the field when the storm began, he would have faced darkness and near-zero visibility. But even then, rangers argue, some sign clothing, prints, a call should have been found the next morning. None was. When investigators retraced the timeline in 1970, they calculated that Dennis could have travelled no more than 1.2 miles downhill before exhaustion or terrain would have stopped him. The search grid covered 5 miles in every direction. No trace. This calculation produced the first mystery of the vanished hour. The distance was too short for him to vanish completely. The second mystery lay in sound. At almost the same time, around 4:30 p.m, the Key family heard a scream echo through Rowan's Creek Valley, several miles away. The terrain between the 2 points was rugged, but aligned along a series of descending ridges. Theoretically, a person or sound could travel between them in under an hour if moving fast and downhill. That correlation has haunted every analysis since. Acoustic modeling done in 2005 by university researchers suggested that under the right temperature and pressure, a human scream from Spence Field could be heard faintly in the Rowans Creek Basin. But the reverse, a scream from the basin heard clearly at the field, was unlikely. This left the direction of the sound uncertain, looping back to the impossible. The third puzzle was the weather. Radar records preserved by the National Weather Service show that the storm front reached Spence Field at 5:20 p.m, yet rain was reported at Cades Cove at 5. This 20-minute offset suggested a gap in the data or a gap in perception. Searchers later found that the topography of the Smokies often creates isolated weather cells, where one ridge is drenched while the next remains dry. In such pockets, visibility can shift from daylight to darkness within minutes. If Dennis had crossed from one cell into another, he could have vanished not by distance, but by light. Some rangers later proposed a fourth explanation, that Dennis may have fallen into one of the storm channels that cut through the slopes during flash floods. These natural trenches, invisible until the rain, can open suddenly and close again under debris. Yet, when the water receded, not a single disturbed patch of earth was found near the field. William Martin kept his own notes on the timeline. In his handwriting, preserved in the park archive, he underlined one phrase: time lost between 4:30 and 5 unaccounted for. To him, this was the heart of the mystery, not the forest, not the terrain, but the clock itself. He believed that something occurred in that narrow band of time which the human record failed to capture. When the FBI reviewed the timeline, they noted how synchronized watches among search leaders differed by as much as 10 minutes. Radios malfunctioned during the storm. Communication delays might have stretched perception, compressing what felt like 30 minutes into nearly an hour. Still, this administrative explanation never satisfied those who had stood in that clearing. In interviews decades later, searcher Dwight McCarter said, "It was as if the mountain folded around that moment. You can track storms, you can track people, but you can't track a silence. That silence between the last laugh of a child and the first roll of thunder remains the center of every reconstruction. It is the point where maps stop making sense and where speculation begins. Some call it coincidence, others call it interference. When historians lay the data side by side, the weather charts, the testimonies, the key families' timing, there is a hollow that cannot be filled, a window of light and warmth erased by rain. The vanished hour sits there, unchanged, repeating itself in every retelling, still without motion, still without sound. The place that never let go. Today, when the fog drifts through the Great Smoky Mountains, it moves the same way it did on that June afternoon in 1969, slow, quiet, indifferent. The ridges rise and fall like waves, their shapes unchanged across the decades. Trees have fallen, trails have shifted, but the story of Dennis Martin remains, folded into the forest like a page left open. The case has no ending, yet the mountain has learned to hold its silence as though it were part of its landscape. Rangers who patrol Spence Field still pass the spot where the Martins camped. There is no plaque or sign to mark it, only the faint clearing where the grass grows a little shorter and the wind feels colder than the surrounding air. On calm mornings, when the mist sits low, visibility shrinks to a few yards. The world becomes small again, just as it was when a child in a red shirt stepped into the brush and never returned. The Park Service no longer speaks publicly about the case. When visitors ask, rangers refer them to the records, but the records lead back to blank pages. Over the years, search maps have faded, and the ink on reports has bled into the paper. Only fragments remain: coordinates, initials, times. The names of the searchers have outlasted their handwriting. Yet even now, the area continues to draw quiet attention from hikers, historians, and those who study what the wilderness keeps to itself. At night, the Smokies change character. The air grows heavy, and sound travels strangely between ridges. From certain angles, voices seem to echo upward rather than outward, carrying across invisible corridors of rock and air. Those who camp near Spence Field say it's easy to lose your bearings after dark. The landscape folds on itself, and light from a lantern may reflect off the mist as if from another fire somewhere beyond view. One retired ranger described it as a place that remembers too well. He meant the forest still reacts when people linger too long, as though memory itself has become part of the terrain. He said that every time he crossed the ridge, he felt the same sensation, the sudden stillness, the pause of wind, the faint pressure in the ears before the weather changes. It's the same breath the mountain took that day, he said. In 2014, a group of park historians revisited the area to photograph old search zones. Their GPS readings didn't match the coordinates in the 1969 reports. The lines drawn decades earlier were slightly off by half a mile in one direction, 3/4 in another. It meant some regions thought to have been searched thoroughly might never have been entered at all. One of those sectors lies just above Rowan's Creek. They found remnants of an old rope line, still looped around a tree, frayed but intact. The rope was logged, photographed, and returned to storage. The report listed it simply as artifact of unknown origin. Locals who have lived along the park's edge for generations rarely talk about the case unless prompted, but when they do, their accounts share an odd consistency. They mention weather that changes without warning. They speak of sudden quiet that comes before a storm, when birds stop singing and the air turns metallic. They describe fog that moves against the wind, flowing uphill as if drawn by something unseen. Each story ends with the same expression: that was the day the mountain took him. Even those who don't believe in anything beyond the physical world feel something different in that part of the park. Visitors write about it in trail journals entries left at shelters along the Appalachian Trail, describing the silence at Spence Field as unnatural, expectant, like waiting for a sound that never comes. Some mention hearing their own names echo faintly when no one else is near. None stay long. Every few years, the National Park Service reopens the case file for administrative review. Each time, the conclusion is the same: insufficient evidence, presumed deceased. Yet within the margins of those official pages are notes that hint at unease. Comments like "search incomplete due to conditions" or "communication interference unexplained." The tone remains calm, procedural, but the language betrays uncertainty. Even in bureaucracy, the mountain's mystery persists. William Martin, Dennis's father, searched until his body could no longer carry him. He never stopped returning to the Smokies. In his final years, he told friends he had come to accept that he would never find his son, but he also refused to call it closure. "It isn't over if you don't understand it," he once said. After his death, a ranger scattered a handful of wildflower seeds near Spence Field in his memory. They still bloom there in late June. Among park staff, there is an unwritten rule. When leading groups through the western ridges, never point out the exact place where Dennis disappeared. The land, they say, doesn't like to be named too often. But occasionally, when the fog lifts and the sunlight filters through the spruce, a guide might stop and gesture toward a patch of grass and say quietly, "That's where the story began." Nothing more. The case continues to live on in quiet ways. Amateur searchers still bring metal detectors, infrared cameras, and mapping drones. None have ever found proof of anything new. Each expedition ends the same way, returning empty-handed, with more questions than before. Some speak of malfunctioning equipment, drained batteries, or GPS signals that loop in circles. The reports sound more like folklore than science, yet they add to the pattern of unease that the mountain seems to cultivate. Scientists studying the park's geology point out that the Smokies rest on layers of folded quartzite and magnetic rock. These can disrupt compasses and electronic devices. To them, the mystery is one of physics, not ghosts. But to the rangers who have walked those ridges at night, that explanation feels too small. The terrain, they say, holds something larger than magnetism, a kind of memory that watches quietly but never repeats itself. When hikers leave Spence Field behind and look back one last time, the meadow appears peaceful, the grass shining under the wind. It looks like any other clearing. Yet somewhere within that ordinary landscape lies a question that has remained unanswered for more than 50 years. How does a child vanish in daylight, surrounded by witnesses, within sight of his father? The park will never answer. The wind continues to move through the spruce, the storms come and go, and each summer the field grows green again. Visitors take photographs, unaware that beneath their feet lies the echo of the most enduring mystery in the Smokies. If you stand there long enough, you may hear nothing but the rustle of grass. Yet for some, that quiet carries weight, a silence that feels older than the forest itself, waiting, patient, unbroken. The mountain keeps its secrets. It always has, and it always will. The Great Smoky Mountains have been searched, mapped, and measured countless times since that afternoon in 1969, but the silence at Spence Field has never changed. Decades later, the ground still gives nothing back. There are no new clues, no final answers, only the wind, the rain, and the memory of a father calling into the fog. Some stories end with truth. Others end with the realization that nature keeps its own kind of memory, one that doesn't explain, only endures. The disappearance of Dennis Martin remains a reminder of how quickly the wilderness can close and how deeply it can hold what it takes. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining us on this journey through one of America's most haunting mysteries. Subscribe for more stories of history, disappearance, and the hidden edges of our world. And remember, sometimes what's lost isn't gone. It's simply waiting somewhere beyond the trail.